Before I ever met my boyfriend's closest friends, he gave me a warning so blunt that I can still remember every word. Callum Reed had been talking about his friend group for weeks. Two other guys and one girl he had known long before he met me. But the night before he finally introduced us, his entire expression changed. "If you ever do anything to hurt Sloan, we're finished," he said. Immediately. No discussion. I stared at him, waiting for the smile that would tell me he was exaggerating. It never came. He explained that Sloan Whitaker was not merely another friend. She was, in his words, one of the most important people in his life. If I wanted a future with him, I was expected to respect her, protect her, and understand that she would always be part of the package. I nodded and told him I understood, but privately, I was fascinated. Every social circle seems to have one person everyone protects, the charming one who is treated as fragile, precious, and permanently innocent. I had met women like that before. They were rarely as harmless as the people surrounding them believed. When I told my roommates what Callum had said, they were furious on my behalf. One of them reminded me that I had never struggled for attention and asked why I was allowing a boyfriend to establish another woman as royalty before I had even met her. The other said the warning alone was enough reason to walk away. I did not argue with them. I fixed my hair, picked up my bag, and met Callum outside. At the time, I told myself I was being mature. Looking back, part of me was simply curious to see what kind of woman could make three grown men behave as if her happiness were a shared responsibility. The moment we entered the cafe, I knew exactly which one she was. Sloan sat in the center of the table wearing a white dress and a bright, effortless smile. Elliot Mercer, the quiet one with glasses, sat on one side of her. Tristan Hale, taller and more openly intense, sat on the other. Callum had described them all beforehand, but he had failed to explain the arrangement. Sloan was not simply part of the group, she was its center of gravity. The men leaned toward her when she spoke, noticed when her glass was empty, and adjusted their expressions according to hers. I had expected her to be distant or territorial. Instead, she sprang from her chair, hurried toward me, and took both my hands, as though we had been waiting years to meet. "You must be Maren," she said. "You're gorgeous. Callum seriously undersold you." Her enthusiasm was convincing enough that someone less observant might have relaxed. I noticed the quick movement of her eyes, though. She studied my hair, clothes, face, and posture in a matter of seconds. It was not admiration, it was assessment. Elliot offered a polite handshake and a restrained smile. Tristan barely concealed his suspicion. Sloan kept hold of my hands and asked in a teasing voice what I had been thinking when I fell for Callum because he was such a disaster. Callum laughed, reached over and ruffled her hair, as if she were a little girl. Then, before sitting down, he removed his jacket and draped it over the back of her chair. "You always get cold," he said. The entire table went strangely quiet. Sloan tilted her head toward me and gave me an exaggerated pout. "Aren't you jealous, Maren? He's already spoiling me, right in front of you." Callum looked at me as though he were waiting for an explosion. Instead, I smiled. "Why would I be jealous, Callum? Told me you're like his little sister. Now that I've met you, I understand. You really are adorable." Her expression held for perhaps half a second too long. It was not enough for the men to notice, but it was enough for me. She had offered me two roles, the jealous girlfriend or the submissive outsider. By calling her a little sister, I had stepped into neither. Sloan recovered quickly. She laughed and told me I was different from Callum's previous girlfriends, all of whom had supposedly hated her for no reason. She claimed she had tried to welcome them, but they had been cruel, insecure, and unwilling to understand the group's bond. I kept my voice warm and said perhaps they had simply misunderstood how sweet she was. Confusion passed over her face again. She had expected resistance, and kindness left her with nothing visible to punish. Dinner arrived, and for several minutes the conversation seemed almost normal. Then, while I was reaching toward the soup, Sloan shifted her glass and jerked back. A splash landed across the front of her white dress. The movement happened so quickly that I could not tell whether my hand had brushed the bowl or whether she had moved it herself. Callum did not wait to determine what had happened. He pushed back his chair, grabbed a napkin, and began blotting the fabric while asking if she was all right. Tristan glared at me. "I knew this was going to happen," he said. Elliot folded his arms and remarked that it was remarkable how I had managed to hurt Sloan during our first meeting. Callum turned on me with a sharpness I had never heard before. "Maren, apologize. Now." Sloan covered part of her face with her hands, but through the gap between her fingers, I saw the smallest, satisfied smile. She wanted anger. If I defended myself, I would confirm everything they had already decided about me. So I let my eyes fill just enough to shine beneath the cafe lights. I told Sloane I was sorry, explained that I had been nervous, and said I would never intentionally embarrass or hurt her. My voice trembled, not dramatically, but enough to make the table reconsider what it had just done. Sloane lowered her hands. For the first time that evening, she looked genuinely uncertain. Her performance had depended on me becoming the aggressor. Instead, I looked like a frightened newcomer being attacked over a minor accident. She forced a laugh and quickly told the men not to blame me. Callum put an arm around me, guilt replacing the anger in his face, but before he could say much, Sloane changed the subject. She reminded him that he had promised to teach her how to swim that evening. Within minutes, everyone was preparing to follow her to the pool. I went with them, smiling quietly. She believed the incident had established her power. What it had actually done was show me exactly how the group functioned. The pool area was washed in soft yellow light. Sloane stood near the edge in a carefully chosen floral swimsuit that made her appear delicate rather than provocative. The three men gathered around her almost automatically. Callum adjusted one of her straps when she complained it felt twisted. Tristan handed her a towel before she asked. Elliot stood nearby, pretending not to watch, though his attention returned to her every few seconds. I removed my sandals, tied my hair back, and walked toward the water. Sloane noticed the shift in their attention immediately. Her smile faltered before becoming bright again. "You came too?" she said. "Do you even know how to swim?" I said. I was not very good, and suggested that Callum might teach me. His hands froze around Sloane's towel. Sloane reminded him in a light voice that he had promised to help her first. Her tone sounded playful, but the look she gave him was not. Callum hesitated, then asked me to wait until he had finished with her. I told him it was fine, and stepped into the water alone. It was cold enough to tighten every muscle in my body. I did not miss the way Callum looked at me, or the way he immediately looked away when he realized Sloane had noticed. She gave a sudden theatrical shriek and grabbed his arm, claiming she was afraid he might let go. He turned back to reassure her, leaving me near the edge by myself. A stranger who had been swimming in the next lane approached and asked whether I needed help. Before I could answer, Callum shouted that I was his girlfriend and told the man to back away. The stranger raised an eyebrow, glanced at Sloane, clinging to Callum's arm, and said it did not look that way from where he was standing. Callum's face reddened. I thanked the stranger and told him I would manage. He handed me a scrap of paper with his number, joked that I should call if I ever grew tired of the circus, and walked away. Sloane giggled, as though the moment were harmless. "Looks like your girlfriend is already making new friends," she said. Callum immediately told me I should not encourage men like that, because they only wanted attention. I looked at him for a moment before answering. I wouldn't have needed his help if I hadn't been standing here alone. That silenced him. Elliot cleared his throat and offered to show me the basics. He said it would only take a few minutes. I accepted. Sloane interrupted, insisting I was fine and that Elliot did not need to involve himself. But he entered the water before she could stop him. Tristan followed more reluctantly, claiming he was only there to make sure no one got hurt. Elliot showed me how to position my legs and control my breathing. I had just started moving away from the wall when a sharp cramp seized my calf. My leg locked, and I slipped lower in the water. Tristan caught me under the arms and pulled me upright, while I tried to explain what was wrong. Elliot moved closer, supported my leg, and pressed carefully along the cramped muscle. Nothing about the moment was romantic. Both men were trying to keep me above water. From the other side of the pool, however, Sloane's voice cut through the room. She demanded to know what Tristan thought he was doing and accused both of them of using the situation as an excuse to touch me. Tristan's grip loosened in surprise. Elliot turned toward her. In that brief second, my weight shifted and I slipped beneath the surface again. When I came up coughing, Elliot leaned in to steady me and our mouths brushed accidentally. It lasted less than a second, but Sloane gasped loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Callum looked furious. Sloane stormed closer and accused me of practically kissing both men in front of my own boyfriend. I was still trying to catch my breath when Elliot finally lost his patience. He told her exactly what had happened. My leg had cramped, I had started sinking, and they had helped me. Tristan backed him immediately. She was in trouble, he said. "You're twisting it." For the first time since I had entered their circle, Sloane's protectors were not standing beside her. They were standing between her and me. Callum stared at Elliot, as if the betrayal were not Sloane's accusation, but Elliot's refusal to support it. He asked whether Elliot was seriously defending me. Elliot replied that he was defending the truth. I climbed out, wrapped myself in a towel, and remained quiet. I did not need to make a speech. The scene had shifted without my help. Sloane attempted to soften her expression and claimed everyone had misunderstood her concern. But no one rushed to reassure her. I could see the realization settling over her. Until then, she had been untouchable because every disagreement became evidence that someone else was cruel. Now, 2 members of her own group had watched her turn an accident into an accusation. When I left the pool, I felt every eye follow me. But for once, I was not merely Callum's girlfriend being evaluated for admission. I was the person who had been placed in danger while Sloane complained about appearances. The following morning, campus felt different. Conversations quieted when I walked past. People glanced at me, then at their phones. By lunch, Callum had sent 2 messages asking me to talk to him. I ignored both and went to the cafeteria. Sloane sat at the group's usual table, but the arrangement had changed. Tristan stared at his phone instead of attending to her. Elliot was nowhere in sight. Callum looked exhausted. Rather than joining them, I took my tray to a table by the window. A few minutes later, Elliot entered, scanned the room, and walked directly toward me. He asked if he could sit down. When I said yes, the surrounding conversations became noticeably quieter. Elliot told me not to pay attention to the gossip. I said I had stopped caring the night before. He gave a small laugh and admitted Sloane was not taking the change well. She's not used to losing control, I said. He looked up at me then, and for the first time I saw respect instead of suspicion. Sloane appeared beside our table before either of us could say more. Her familiar smile had returned, but her hands trembled slightly. She wished us both a pointedly cheerful morning and told Elliot she could see he had switched sides. He sighed and said, "There were no sides. There are always sides," she replied. She asked whether she could sit, though. She was already lowering herself into the chair. Then she told me she had heard interesting stories about how close I had become to every man in the group. According to the rumors, I had been flirting with Elliot Tristan, and even my own boyfriend, as if they were interchangeable prizes. I told her rumors traveled quickly when someone was desperate enough to create them. Her face lost color for an instant. She asked whether I truly believed I could turn her friends against her. "I don't need to," I said. "You're doing that yourself." Elliot tried to interrupt, but Sloane snapped at him before immediately apologizing and returning to the sweet voice she used when other people were watching. She said she simply hated lies. I told her that was a good reason to stop creating them. The cafeteria had grown so quiet that I could hear the refrigerator humming across the room. Sloane leaned toward me and said I was not as innocent as I pretended to be. I answered that neither was she. That was the first time I saw her mask break completely. She stood and asked whether I thought I had won. "I think I stopped playing your game," I said. She stared at me, then left, her steps striking the floor hard enough to carry through the room. The moment she disappeared, the cafeteria erupted into whispers. Elliot looked impressed, but uneasy. He warned me she would not let the humiliation go. I told him I was counting on that. That evening, an unknown number sent me a message. "You think this is over. You have no idea who you're dealing with." I did not need to ask who had written it. By then, the conflict was no longer about winning Callum's attention. It was about whether Sloane could continue controlling every person around her simply by choosing a new victim. The next day, I entered the cafeteria and found Sloane standing near the center of the room with her phone in her hand. 2 girls I barely recognized stood on either side of her. They looked like temporary replacements for the loyalty she had begun to lose. She greeted me brightly and remarked that I had been very productive with the men in her group. When I asked whether she was spreading more rumors, she raised her phone and said she had screenshots. A ripple of interest moved through the room. She turned the display toward me. The images showed conversations supposedly sent from my account, dozens of messages in which I appeared to flirt with Elliot and Tristan insult Sloane, and describe a plan to split the group apart. At first glance, they were convincing. The profile image was mine. The wording imitated the way I texted. The problem was that Sloane had rushed. The timestamps and account details did not align properly, and the messages did not match anything stored on my phone. More importantly, I had already received the warning from Tristan the night before. He had not known exactly what she intended to show, but he knew she had been asking questions about editing screenshots, and had suggested that he help prove I was manipulating everyone. I told Sloane that next time she fabricated evidence, she should check the time settings and account information before displaying it publicly. Her confidence slipped. Elliot rose from a nearby table and crossed the room. He looked through the real message history on my phone, compared it to the images Sloane had shown, and asked her directly whether she had created the conversations herself. She called the suggestion ridiculous. Elliot's voice remained low, but it carried through the cafeteria. He told her what was ridiculous was the distance she would go to preserve control over people who had once trusted her. Tristan entered in the middle of the confrontation. He stopped when he saw Sloane holding the phone and seemed to understand immediately what had happened. After a long pause, he admitted she had asked him to assist with the fake messages. He had refused, but the request itself confirmed that the screenshots were not real. The room fell silent. Sloane's new companions shifted away from her, suddenly aware that they had joined the wrong performance. I asked whether she had truly believed a collection of fabricated texts would destroy me. I told her she had been far more effective when she played innocent, because aggression exposed how frightened she was of losing influence. For a moment, I expected her to scream. Instead, she stood completely still, clutching her phone, while whispers moved through the cafeteria. Elliot told me we should leave. We walked out together without looking back. I knew what people would say after we were gone. For the first time, Sloane was no longer the center of the story because everyone adored her. She was the center because they had watched her lie. Later that evening, I found her sitting alone in the garden behind the library. I had not deliberately gone looking for her, but I was not surprised to see her there. She wore no makeup and had no friends arranged around her. Her shoulders shook slightly as she stared at her phone. Without looking up, she told me that if I had come to gloat, I should get it over with. I sat at the far end of the stone bench and said I had not come to celebrate. The truth was that I had wanted her exposed, but I had not expected the victory to feel so empty. She laughed bitterly and said I had already won. I told her I had not defeated her. She had simply run out of people willing to stand in front of the consequences for her. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Sloane asked whether I knew what it was like to spend an entire life being told that people loved you because you were perfect. She said perfection had become less of a compliment than a threat. If she stopped being charming, beautiful, vulnerable, or necessary, she believed everyone would leave. Sitting there, without her audience, she did not look powerful. She looked exhausted. I told her perhaps this was the first opportunity she had ever had to discover who she was when she was not performing for anyone. She wiped her eyes and asked whether I thought that would be easy. I said no, but it was a beginning. For once, she did not argue. When I walked away, I did not feel triumphant. I felt finished. I assumed the public exposure would finally settle everything, but the next 2 days were strangely quiet. Sloane stopped appearing in class. Tristan moved to another study group. Elliot kept some distance, though I sometimes noticed him looking toward me in the library. Callum lingered around the edges of my routine like someone waiting for permission to re-enter it. One evening, as I left a lecture hall, he called my name from near the stairs. His shoulders were tense, and he looked smaller than the man who had once warned me never to upset Sloane. He said we needed to talk about everything. I asked what explanation could possibly change what had happened. He admitted he had failed me and said he had never intended to cause harm. I reminded him that intention had not stopped him from hurting me. He said that when Sloane accused me, he panicked because he had spent years believing she was fragile and needed protection. Protection from what, I asked. Reality. Callum looked at the floor. I asked whether he understood that every time Sloane became upset, he had forced me to apologize before asking what had actually happened. He said he had wanted to be the person who kept her safe. I asked where that had left me. His silence answered more honestly than anything else. I told him he had not wanted a girlfriend. He had wanted another person he could manage, forgive, and rescue, according to rules he created. He insisted he had loved me. I told him he had loved the certainty that I would continue forgiving him. That was the part that finally broke through his defenses. He reached into his pocket and took out the small silver ring he had given me months earlier. It was not an engagement ring, only a simple band that had once represented a promise between us. He said he supposed it no longer belonged to him. I told him it never had. He nodded and walked away without trying to bargain. What surprised me was how little it hurt. I had imagined the end of our relationship would feel like losing something enormous. Instead, it felt like placing down a weight I had been carrying for so long that I had mistaken it for part of myself. Later that week, I saw Elliot outside the library. He was leaning against the column with a book in his hand. When he noticed me, he closed it and said I looked lighter. I told him I felt lighter. He said I had handled the entire situation more gracefully than anyone he knew. I corrected him. I had not handled it. I had survived it. He laughed softly and said surviving still counted. We stood together in a silence that did not feel demanding. Eventually, he asked whether I was finished fighting. I said I thought I was. He stepped a little closer and told me he was hoping we might begin something that did not require armor. I laughed for the first time in weeks without measuring how it would sound. Elliot quickly clarified that he was only suggesting coffee, or perhaps jazz. He knew a small place off campus where the music was good and, according to him, drama was not permitted. The idea sounded almost absurd after everything that had happened, but I agreed. The cafe was smaller than I expected, with brick walls, dim lights, and live music soft enough to leave room for conversation. Elliot had chosen a table beside the window half removed from the crowd. A waitress brought coffee and a slice of pie for us to share. For a while, neither of us spoke. The quiet did not feel awkward because he was not studying me for signs of jealousy, weakness, or competition. He was simply present. I asked whether he visited the place often. He said he used to come when he needed somewhere to think. When I asked what he came for now, he looked at me and said he would rather listen. I told him it felt strange that I did not feel empty after losing Callum and the entire group. Elliot said that was not strange. Sometimes healing felt less like gaining something and more like noticing that the pressure had stopped. His answer stayed with me because he did not frame himself as the reason I felt better. For months, Callum and his friends had tried to manage every reaction around Sloan. Elliot was the first person who seemed more interested in understanding than directing me. I asked whether he ever became tired of being the calm one. He admitted he did, but said that if he began shouting too, there would be no one left to listen. I told him he was not what I had expected. Before the pool, I had assumed he was another version of Callum, someone who would help Sloan control the story and then blame everyone else for the consequences. Elliot said I did not need another person to lead my story. I needed someone who would not rewrite it. The sentence landed harder than he probably intended. After a pause, I asked why he had defended me at the pool when he barely knew me. He looked down at his hands before answering. He said he had recognized the expression on my face, the look of someone who believed no explanation would be accepted because the verdict had already been decided. He had seen that expression before and could not stand by while it happened again. He did not explain further, and I did not force him. His answer was enough. Some people needed a truth teller more than they needed a hero. At some point, I reached across the table and touched his hand. The gesture was not a promise. It was simply the first connection I had made in a long time without calculating who might become jealous. We stayed for hours talking about our families, classes, the unreliable campus lights, and our mutual dislike of cafeteria food. Elliot joked that it might be the first evening in months when no one was gossiping about us. I told him to give them time. He smiled and said that perhaps the next story people told would at least be true. When we left, the air outside was cool and clear. Elliot walked beside me without crowding me or hanging back. At my dorm, he asked whether he could see me again. I teased him that he had just seen me, then agreed to meet him the following evening. His entire face brightened. He started to leave, stopped, and thanked me for allowing him to see the version of me that was not preparing for a fight. I did not know how to answer, so I smiled. He walked away, with his hands in his jacket pockets, while the last notes of jazz remained in my head. For the first time since I had entered Callum's friend group, I felt as though something good might begin, without requiring someone else to lose. A few nights later, Tristan sent me a message asking whether we could speak behind the gym. He said he owed me something. I nearly ignored it. Tristan had been one of the first people to accuse me at the cafe, and he had looked at me as a threat long before I had done anything. Still, he had also refused to help Sloan fabricate the screenshots and had exposed her in front of everyone. I agreed to meet him. He was waiting beneath a street lamp near the back lot, his arms crossed and his attention fixed on the ground. He said he had spent days thinking about Sloan and how easily all three men had surrendered control of the group to her. Tristan admitted she had rarely needed to demand anything directly. She would become quiet cry or suggest someone had hurt her, and they would compete to repair the situation. Protecting her made them feel useful. Their willingness to feel useful made her powerful. He said he could not even direct all his anger toward her because he hated how eagerly he had participated. I reminded him that he had not been the only one. He said he had been the loudest person blaming me, and that was not something he could erase by exposing one lie. I asked why he had wanted to meet. He said he had told Sloan and Callum that he was finished with the group's hero routine. He no longer wanted to confuse silence with loyalty. I told him that was good. He seemed surprised that I did not deliver a lecture or a speech about revenge. I explained that I was tired. I no longer wanted to defeat anyone. I wanted to stop playing altogether. Tristan smiled faintly and said, Elliot and I made sense because Elliot had been the only person in the group who eventually looked at me without flinching. When I asked how Tristan had looked at me, he answered honestly. He had seen me as competition. It had taken him far too long to understand that I was trying to survive the same system that trapped all of them. I offered my hand. After a pause, he shook it. There were no dramatic apologies or promises of friendship. He told me to take care of myself, and I said the same. He walked toward the parking lot, and the simple ending felt more meaningful than another confrontation would have. The following afternoon, I saw Sloane alone on a bench near the Humanities building. A notebook rested open on her lap, though she did not appear to be writing. She wore a plain gray hoodie and looked like any other exhausted college student. For a moment, I considered walking past. She looked up before I could decide. There was no anger in her expression, only recognition. She said I did not need to tell her how terrible she had behaved because she already knew. I sat at the opposite end of the bench and asked why she had continued even after realizing what she was doing. She said being Sloane, the person everyone adored, protected, and watched, was the only identity that had ever made sense to her. Without an audience reflecting that version back, she did not know what remained. I told her she still had time to find out, but she would have to stop searching for mirrors and begin looking outward. She gave a small, broken laugh and said the sentence sounded like something I would post on Reddit. I said perhaps I would. For the first time, we smiled at each other, without either smile being a weapon. As I stood to leave, she quietly said she hoped I was happy now. I told her I was learning how to be. There was no bitterness in either voice. That evening, Elliot met me on the stone steps outside the main building and handed me a coffee prepared exactly the way I liked it. 1 cream, no sugar. I accused him of thinking I was predictable. He said he liked that some things about me could be trusted. We sat as the sunset stretched across the courtyard. Our shoulders touched lightly, but neither of us tried to turn the moment into a performance. He asked what came next. I laced my fingers through his and said, perhaps we could stop trying to repair people who had never asked to be saved. Maybe we could simply learn how to live. He said he could live with that. The sun disappeared and the silence around us demanded nothing. It was not the opening move in another game. It was the beginning of peace. Weeks passed steadily. Campus life returned to normal because life has a way of absorbing even the most dramatic events. Sloane returned to class and began spending time with people who did not arrange themselves around her like guards. She smiled less often, but when she did, the expression looked more genuine. Tristan transferred to evening courses. I saw him once in the library, wearing headphones and writing in a notebook. He gave me a small wave, and I returned it. That was enough. Callum drifted somewhere between regret and rebuilding. He began spending time with a quieter group of people who did not seem to need him to rescue them. Occasionally, we passed each other on the quad. We would nod, exchange a brief greeting, and continue walking. There was no dramatic hatred between us, only distance. Elliot became part of my routine, without demanding a defined role. Some mornings we met for coffee before class. Other afternoons, we studied in the library without speaking for an hour. He never tried to fix my mood. He simply stayed long enough for me to understand that presence and control were not the same thing. One Friday evening, we sat on the steps outside the main hall while the last students crossed the courtyard. The air carried the scent of rain and jasmine. Elliot handed me another coffee and said this was what people meant by the calm after a storm. I admitted the calm felt unfamiliar. Part of me still expected another accusation, confrontation, or crisis. He looked at me and said there did not have to be one. I told him that possibility was new to me. He smiled and said I should become accustomed to it. We remained quiet until I finally admitted the worst part of the entire experience. It was not the rumors or even Callum's betrayal. It was that I had become so focused on outmaneuvering Sloane that I had forgotten who I was when nobody was watching. Elliot asked who I believed I was now. I thought about the woman who had entered that cafe, prepared to compete for a place in someone else's hierarchy. I remembered how carefully I had controlled every smile, tear, and sentence, because I knew any genuine reaction could be used against me. Then I considered the person sitting beside him, still imperfect, still healing, but no longer trying to win. Someone who doesn't need to perform, I said. Elliot nodded and told me that was his favorite version of me. That night, I chose to walk back to my dorm alone. He offered to come with me, but I wanted the quiet. The paths were almost empty, and the lights along the campus reflected in the dark windows. For once, I did not look away from my own reflection. The jealousy, accusations, false messages, and power games already felt like events from a story that no longer controlled me. I was not the helpless victim Sloane had attempted to create. I was not the villain her friends had expected. I was simply the person who had lived through it and finally understood what it meant. When I reached my room, my phone buzzed. The message was from Sloane. She thanked me for not destroying her completely. I stared at the words for a long time. Months earlier, I might have felt victorious. Instead, I typed that she was welcome and told her to take care of herself. Then I turned off my phone and went to bed. The world outside was quiet, but the silence inside me was different from the silence I had felt when Callum first warned me never to upset her. That earlier silence had been restraint. This one was freedom. In the end, the story had never truly been about whether I could win Callum, defeat Sloane, or take her place at the center of their group. It was about recognizing that I did not need a place inside their orbit at all. I had spent so much time learning how to survive someone else's game that I nearly missed the simplest choice available to me. I could walk away and choose myself. Estimated character count, approximately 34,600 characters length. Check within target compared with the source. Format check, compact paragraph achieved.